When a child speaks up, will the truth finally be heard? A shocking revelation is about to change everything. The packed courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the weight of curiosity thick in the air. Every seat was filled, the audience leaning forward in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters whispered into their microphones, and the judge sat high above them all, eyes locked on the small boy standing before him. Elijah Walker, just 10 years old, stood alone at the center of it all. His heart pounded in his chest, his small hands clenched at his sides. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay strong. The courtroom air felt thick, pressing in on him, but he didn't let it shake him. He had come too far to falter now. In front of him, lying on the courtroom table, was a newborn baby wrapped in a soft, white blanket. The infant stirred slightly, letting out a quiet whimper that momentarily broke the heavy silence. The sound made Elijah's breath hitch, but he didn't look away. His focus remained on the judge, unwavering. The judge, an imposing figure with piercing eyes and a skeptical expression, leaned forward. He cleared his throat, his voice deep and firm. "You expect us to believe this child belongs to you?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The audience exchanged looks of disbelief and curiosity. The murmurs grew louder as people whispered among themselves. Elijah could feel their judgment, their doubt. But he had already prepared for this moment. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. The prosecution lawyer leaned in, adjusting his tie. "This is a serious claim, young man. Do you understand the weight of what you're saying?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't waver. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly, his voice stronger than he expected. He had practiced this answer in his head over and over again, and he knew there was no room for hesitation now. The judge tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, signaling for order. The whispers died down, and the weight of silence pressed heavier upon Elijah's small frame. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he remained still. The courtroom door creaked as someone entered, but Elijah didn't turn to look. He knew every movement in the room could be a distraction, and he couldn't afford to lose focus. This was his moment. He couldn't back down. The baby whimpered again, her tiny fingers curling slightly over the fabric of the blanket. The sound filled the room, reminding everyone just how real this situation was. Elijah's gaze didn't falter. He stood taller, knowing that his words, his truth, were the only things that mattered now. The room fell into silence. Every eye in the courtroom was on him, waiting, watching, judging. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Have you ever spoken up when no one believed you? Share your story. Just 24 hours earlier, Elijah Walker had been walking home, the chill of the evening air biting at his skin. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. His worn sneakers scuffed against the cracked sidewalk as he passed the alleyway behind the corner store, a route he had taken countless times before. Then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible cry. Elijah froze. The sound was faint, nearly lost beneath the distant hum of traffic. He turned toward the alley, his pulse quickening. Carefully, he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space between the dumpsters and discarded cardboard boxes. Another cry, fragile, pleading. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted the source. Nestled inside a worn, tattered blanket, barely visible against the cold metal of the dumpster, was a tiny baby. The infant's tiny fists trembled as it let out another weak wail, its face scrunched in discomfort. Elijah's heart pounded. His feet moved before his mind could process what he was doing. He knelt down, his hands shaking, as he carefully picked up the fragile child. The baby was so small, so helpless. Its skin was cold to the touch, and Elijah instinctively wrapped it inside his jacket, pressing it close to his chest. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over his racing heartbeat. "I got you." He looked around, searching for any sign of who might have left the baby there. But the alley was empty. Whoever had abandoned this child was long gone. Elijah knew he had to act fast. He ran, his legs burning as he sprinted through the streets toward home. He didn't stop until he burst through the door of his grandmother's small apartment, gasping for breath. "Mama, look! Someone left him all alone," he exclaimed, his voice filled with urgency. Miss Ruby, his grandmother, turned from the stove, her eyes widening at the sight of Elijah cradling the tiny bundle. She rushed over, her experienced hands reaching for the baby, her face a mixture of shock and concern. "Lord, have mercy," she breathed, gently peeling back the jacket to get a better look. The baby stirred, letting out a weak whimper. "Elijah, where did you find this child?" "Behind the store, near the dumpster," he said quickly. "Someone just left him there." "I couldn't leave him." Miss Ruby hesitated, her brows knitting together as she took in the situation. She was a woman of deep wisdom, someone who had seen the world's cruelty and kindness in equal measure. She knew the weight of this moment, the responsibility now resting in their hands. She sighed, nodding slowly. "We'll take him to the hospital in the morning. For now, we need to keep him warm." Elijah exhaled in relief, watching as Miss Ruby cradled the baby with care. He had done the right thing. But something in his gut told him this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could have imagined. What would you do if you found a baby abandoned like this? "Let's talk." The next morning, Elijah Walker and Miss Ruby bundled up the baby and made their way to the police station. The streets were quiet, the early morning chill still clinging to the city. Elijah held the infant close, his heart racing. He had barely slept, the weight of the night before pressing down on him. Miss Ruby walked with purpose, her grip firm on Elijah's hand. "We're doing the right thing, baby," she assured him. "That child deserves a chance." When they stepped inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a stark glow over the waiting area. Officers moved about, answering phones and shuffling paperwork. Miss Ruby approached the front desk, her voice steady. "We found this baby abandoned behind the store last night." The officer on duty raised an eyebrow, glancing from the bundled infant to Elijah. "You said you found the baby?" he asked, looking skeptical. Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir, all alone." Before the officer could respond, a voice cut through the room. "Bring them back, now." Elijah turned his head as another officer stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. "Come with me." They followed him down a narrow hallway into a small, dimly lit office. The officer gestured for them to sit. Miss Ruby did, but Elijah remained standing, still holding the baby. Then the officer dropped a file onto the desk. "A missing child report was filed this morning, just a few hours ago." Elijah felt his stomach tighten. Miss Ruby frowned. "By who?" The officer exhaled, watching them carefully. "Judge Henry Calloway." A beat of silence stretched between them. Elijah's mind raced. Judge Calloway, the same man presiding over his case. Miss Ruby tensed, her hand tightening on her purse. "That don't make no sense," she said slowly. "How does he know about this baby?" The officer hesitated, shifting in his seat. "That's not the strange part," he admitted. "Something about the report doesn't sit right. The way he filed it, the urgency. It's like he already knew the child was going to be found. Elijah's pulse quickened. He stole a glance at Miss Ruby, whose lips had pressed into a firm line. She reached over and gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "Something ain't right, baby," she whispered. "Be careful." Elijah nodded, gripping the baby a little tighter. He could feel it, too. Something about this didn't add up. The officer cleared his throat. "We need to keep the baby here for now. We have to follow procedure." Miss Ruby nodded, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Why was the judge so involved? And why did the police seem uneasy about it? One thing was certain. This wasn't just about an abandoned child anymore. This was something much bigger. Do you think there's more to this story? Drop your thoughts below. Elijah Walker stood in the center of the packed courtroom, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart pounded against his ribs as he met Judge Henry Calloway's piercing gaze. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he refused to back down. The judge sat high above the room, his expression hard, unreadable. He gripped his gavel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "And how exactly do you know this, son?" His voice rang out, controlled but tense. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could hear the whispers spreading through the room, the audience shifting in their seats. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Because of this," Elijah declared, his voice clear and unwavering. Gasps filled the room as he unfolded the document, revealing a torn birth certificate, one he had found tucked inside the baby's blanket. The name on the document made the judge's face go pale. Amelia Calloway. Elijah held up the paper for all to see. "This baby's mother is Amelia Calloway, your daughter." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. All eyes turned to Judge Calloway, who suddenly looked as if the walls were closing in on him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Miss Ruby, seated behind Elijah, placed a hand over her chest. She had known something wasn't right, but she hadn't expected this. Elijah took a step forward, his voice growing stronger. "You abandoned your own grandson," he said, his words cutting through the silence. "And now you want to pretend he never existed." Judge Calloway slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "Enough!" he barked, his face twisting in anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Elijah didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know you tried to hide him. I know you didn't want anyone to find out. But I did. And now everyone else knows, too." The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge's breathing was heavy, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Camera shutters clicked. The whispers turned into murmurs, then full-fledged conversations as the weight of Elijah's words settled over the room. Miss Ruby's voice cut through the noise. "It's time to tell the truth, Judge. That baby deserves better." Judge Calloway's shoulders sagged slightly, his grip on the gavel loosening. For the first time since Elijah stepped into the courtroom, the power in the room shifted. Elijah stood tall, knowing he had done what needed to be done. No matter what happened next, the truth was out. "Would you have spoken up like Elijah? Let's discuss." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, and hurried whispers filled the space as Judge Henry Calloway's face drained of color. He stammered, gripping his gavel as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. His carefully constructed world, built on power and reputation, was crumbling in front of everyone. "Order!" the judge bellowed, his voice cracking slightly. He slammed his gavel down once, twice, but the courtroom had already spiraled beyond his control. Elijah Walker stood his ground, his small frame unwavering. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the disbelief, the shock, the slow realization that the truth had finally surfaced. Then, the prosecution attorney stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe the time for questioning is over. We have evidence to present." The room hushed slightly, the tension thick. The attorney motioned toward the bailiff, who handed over a thick file. "We have obtained a sworn testimony from a nurse who worked at the facility where Amelia Calloway gave birth. She confirms that the child was indeed born to your daughter. Furthermore, we have a DNA test result, verifying that this infant is your biological grandson." A murmur rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled to write. Cameras flashed, and the sound of rustling papers filled the air. Judge Calloway's fingers twitched, his mask of authority faltering. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The prosecution attorney didn't back down. "Your daughter was disowned, wasn't she? Cut off from your name, your wealth, and your protection. You saw this baby as a stain on your legacy, didn't you? That's why you wanted him gone." Miss Ruby clutched Elijah's shoulder, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You saved that child's life," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "And now everyone knows the truth." Elijah didn't look away from the judge. "You tried to erase him," he said, his voice steady. "But he's here, and he matters." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Elijah had ever felt. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a reckoning. Do you believe justice was served? Let's talk about it. With Judge Calloway exposed, the weight of his downfall reverberated through the courtroom and beyond. His once unshakable authority crumbled under the undeniable truth. The scandal sent shockwaves through the city, and within days he was forced to step down from the bench. His influence, once absolute, had been shattered by the courage of a 10-year-old boy who refused to stay silent. Meanwhile, the infant, now named Noah, was placed in the care of Miss Ruby. The state recognized her as a temporary guardian, a decision met with overwhelming public support. People from all over reached out, offering donations and resources to help. Miss Ruby, with her steady hands and boundless heart, welcomed the child into her home, knowing that love, not blood, made a family. Elijah Walker, once just a kid from a struggling neighborhood, had become something more. The news spread like wildfire. Articles, interviews, and headlines painted him as a hero. The boy who spoke the truth, the child who brought down a judge. Cameras flashed as reporters crowded outside Miss Ruby's home, eager for a statement. But Elijah wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He only cared about one thing: Noah. Standing on the small porch, he cradled the baby in his arms, shielding him from the chaos outside. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. Miss Ruby placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did good, baby. Real good." Elijah nodded, looking down at Noah's tiny face. The world had tried to forget this child, but he had refused to let that happen. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Elijah knew that this was just the beginning. He had stepped up when no one else would. He had fought for justice when it would have been easier to walk away. And in doing so, he had changed more than just Noah's life. He had changed his own. What's the biggest lesson from Elijah's journey? Let's discuss in the comments. Elijah's bravery not only saved a life, but exposed a system built to silence the truth. His actions had sparked something far greater than he ever imagined. What started as a desperate attempt to do the right thing had now set off a chain reaction, shaking the very foundation of the justice system. Judge Calloway's fall sent ripples far beyond the courtroom. His resignation forced officials to re-examine past rulings, uncovering patterns of corruption that had long been ignored. The case became a national conversation, igniting discussions on accountability, privilege, and the power of speaking up. Meanwhile, Miss Ruby, now officially Noah's guardian, vowed that he would never feel abandoned again. Her home, once a place of quiet resilience, was now a haven of hope. With the help of the community, she ensured that Noah had everything he needed: a warm bed, a loving family, and a future far brighter than his past. Elijah Walker, the boy who once walked invisible through the streets of his struggling neighborhood, was no longer just a child. He had become a symbol of courage. His story traveled beyond his city, inspiring others to speak up, to question the powerful, and to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. Reporters continued to seek him out, but Elijah never sought attention. He simply wanted to live a life where the truth mattered, where no one else would have to suffer in silence. Standing in the doorway of Miss Ruby's house, he looked down at Noah, who cooed softly in his arms. "You're safe now," he whispered once more, a promise he intended to keep. Elijah had proven that even the smallest voices could bring down giants, that justice wasn't just for those with power. It belonged to everyone. What does Elijah's story teach us about standing up for the truth? Let's talk.